Hello, welcome to another edition of 30 Minutes with the Author. I'm your host, Lori Crever. Today, we're very excited to have with us Jane Yolen, who is a distinguished author of more than 200 books. Welcome to the show, Jane.
Glad to be here.
Let's talk about the book you have with you today, Gray Heroes, and it's a book of elder folk tales.
I began this book actually because of the internet. I never thought I would say that, actually. But someone in one of the chat lines was going on about how they had found two very interesting folk tales that were about elderly, adventurous people, and they wondered where to find others. And I thought, well, being a sort of a folklorist, I'll answer them. And I went to my folklore collection and I looked in some of the stuff, and I couldn't find any books that were specifically on this. And I thought, maybe if there is no such book, I should be putting it together.
Yes.
So, and especially because I was edging towards 60 at that time.
Right. Let's talk about what really, I mean, you've written in so many different genres, and you are a storyteller. Mm-hmm. What is it that prompted you to compile this book?
Well, first of all, there was a need. I really saw a need. Clearly, no one had ever done it before. That always interests me. Why didn't they do it?
Right.
And I think the answer to that was that they were a little hard to find. There are many stories about interesting and engaging elders in folklore, but there are just as many about nasty hags and tricky old men and the sort of drooling, incontinent elderly person that nobody wants to have anything to do with.
Yes, that's what I was thinking of. When I think of a fairy tale, I think of the heroes are young, strong, handsome, beautiful, etc. And if there are any old people in it, they're in the background, or what you just said. They're sort of craggy and haggy and...
But the interesting problem is that most of the storytellers were the ancients. These were the people who were the carriers of the culture. These were the people who were the ones who had all of the wisdom of the ages, and they were sort of the repository of a tribe or a clan's knowledge and history. Mm-hmm. So I began to ask myself, why weren't they also telling stories about interesting, wise, adventurous, mature people? Yes. It occurred to me that, in fact, many of those ancients were probably about 45, or not that old. But also, I think a lot of the stories that did exist got moved back because most of the old stories in the last 150 years got moved into the nursery. Mm-hmm. And kids aren't all that interested in hearing stories about the wisdom of the ages. They want the adventurous young person who goes out and, kicks the dragon in the rear.
Right.
So when I started finding these stories, they were really in one would be in one book here and one would be in another book there. They didn't have 4 or 5 in any one book.
Right, there wasn't a compendium.
Yeah.
Tell us how did you find these stories? Did you have to, I noticed you have many countries are represented. Did you travel quite a bit? And tell us about that process.
I didn't travel because I own an enormous number of books of folklore, and I haunt library sales. And when they throw out an entire section of it,
you're in the dumpster.
There I am. But I also go to storytelling conventions and do storytelling, and I would always ask people, do you know any stories about hardy, adventurous, interesting elder folk in folk tales? Interestingly enough, most of the stories that they told me, I had already found. So then, after I did the easy kind of work, through the Grimms, through the Russian tales, through the ones that everybody has, then I started looking into folklore journals, American folklore journals, the British folklore journals, that sort of thing. In the last, I'd say, 15, 20 years, there's been an explosion of folk tale books. Not enough, unfortunately, in the South American tales. Those are really, I think, the hardest to discover. And some of the cultures, especially tribal cultures that were really sort of on the edge of difficult lives, like Eskimos, Inuit stories. One would think, when you think back about what you learned about these cultures in high school, say, I thought, oh, they wouldn't have any ancient tales or wisdom tales because they were always putting people out on the ice floes when they got too old to help. But in fact, they had wonderful stories about old people making long trips around the world, or there's a wonderful Eskimo love story. Those sorts of things I found fascinating. So basically, we buried those stories.
Yeah, I guess.
Well, and especially in America, where we were so youth obsessed
It's
anyway.
such a youth culture.
Yeah.
Yes. What was it in pulling together these stories? Was there something that surprised you the most, whether it be about a certain country where you thought, oh, that's really interesting. I wasn't expecting that to come from that place, or...
Well, I was expecting a lot of wisdom stories, and of course,
Right,
that's what I saw the most,
yes.
wisdom stories. And I also did some trickery stories, because very often the trickster stories are not only fun to tell, but they show another kind of characteristic of wisdom. It's a sort of, not the flip side of wisdom, but a kind of left turn on wisdom. The sort of Loki character, the raven, the chaos character, who always I find very appealing. But I was surprised, except for Baucus and Filament, I didn't know other love stories with old people, and I didn't know any of the adventure stories. I mean, there's one story in the book in which an elderly person gets rid of a dragon, and another where an old woman manages to sneak down and let loose all of the boats of the Danish raiders, so because she knows when the tides turn, and she manages to float their boats out to sea so that the townspeople can destroy them. So I found the adventure stories, I think, the most interesting.
Yes. Well, how about let's read.
Okay.
And do an excerpt so that people get an idea. I really found these stories to be very special, like taking me back to when you would read Aesop's fables, and that's probably in late elementary school or early junior high. There is a real connection that you feel sort of to the planet and to human history and how these stories have come down, and there's a lot of stability in them and a lot of applicability, no matter what country that you're living in now in your lifetime. You can really gain something. That's what I found reading
find
them.
these stories also talking points. I think you tell the story, you read the story, and then you can do it with a group of people, and then talk about it, and suddenly people are talking about their own lives. They're not just talking about the story, but they make that next leap. And I'd love to actually go into some nursing homes or elder communities and work with these stories and the people there.
Yes.
This is one from the Philippines. It's called The Old Woman and the Giant. In a cave near the village of Umang, there once lived a wicked and greedy giant. He would kill and eat anyone who happened to pass by the cave, which is why everybody tried to avoid the place. Now, one day, an old woman who had gone to the woods to gather fuel lost her way and found herself near the giant's cave. And seeing her, the giant shouted, "Now I am going to kill and eat you, unless you can show me that you can make a louder noise than I." This frightened the old woman, but being wise and shrewd, she kept her head. "What good will it do you if you eat a skinny old woman like me?" she asked the giant. "But if you let me go, I'll fetch my daughter, who's young and stout. Then, if you can make more noise than the two of us together, you may kill both of us, and you'll really have something good to eat." So the giant's greed was aroused, and he told the old woman, "All right, you may go, but be sure to come back and bring your stout daughter with you." The old woman went home and returned as she had promised, bringing her daughter with her. She also brought a drum, and her daughter had a bronze gong. And as soon as they neared the cave, the old woman began to beat her drum, and at the same time the daughter began to beat the gong, and the noise they made was so great that the giant could not hear his own voice, no matter how hard he shouted. When he could no longer stand the noise, he covered his ears with his hands, dashed blindly out of the cave, and fell into a great hole. And that was the end of the wicked and greedy giant. And the people of the whole countryside rejoiced at his death. So she wasn't about to go at him one-on-one, but she managed to do the kind of what I would call the Billy Goat Gruff defense. You know, I'm too skinny and scrawny, but if you wait till the next one comes along, he's bigger. And she brings her daughter, but the two of them together. I mean, I love the fact that the mother and the daughter work together on this story and get rid of the giant.
Yeah, I think that does seem to be a theme in some of these, or in folk legends, has to do with the lesson of family and loyalty within the family. Do you find that as well as, as a theme?
Some of that. I'm actually now working on another folklore book, but with my daughter, in which we're doing folk tales that have mother and daughter themes. Sometimes you have good mothers, sometimes you have bad mothers, sometimes you have simply terrible mothers.
And stepmothers.
And
I mean, they've never recovered from the public relations job that fairy tales have done through
Well,
the ages.
in fact, though, very often the fairy tale used the stepmother in place of the mother because they didn't want to say those awful things about the mother.
Oh my goodness.
But variants of those same stories, variants of the, say, the Snow White or the the Snow White story, very often have, it is the mother. It's not a stepmother. It is an actual mother. So we're then having conversations after the stories and doing what I suggested doing with this book, which is taking the story and making a leap into your own life and seeing how those stories reflect or elucidate or bring up things you hadn't been thinking about for years.
Yes, I found it created that effect on me as well, that I would read while I was taking the bus to work, and then I would come in and I would have to share something with a coworker about the story, or, you know, this made me think of my grandparents, or, you know, just making me think of how valuable that part of our society is. That's what I'd like to talk about next, is just the subject of the mature part of our population. And it's really celebrated in your book, Gray Heroes.
What happens when we think back about our grandparents? I mean, my grandmother, when I think about her, I remember her with this wonderful round face and very pink cheeks and white hair. And it was bound up on top of her head in a crown of braids. And that was my vision of old age.
And we're looking at the picture of her right now. And is that your grandfather with her?
My grandfather with her. Now, that is an elderly woman. But in that picture, she's a year younger than I am now. My mother died a year younger than I am now. And I'm sure that my children, what they remember of her was an older woman, was an elderly woman. But she wasn't. She was 59.
Right. That's not really old by our standards.
That's right. So when did elderly change?